Hello, everyone. My name is Terrence, and I'm here in quarantine with no one else to speak with. So, I guess the easiest substitute is to talk to an inanimate object here and pretend that I'm actually having a conversation. So, for today's topic, I'm going to talk about why I'm not a big fan of the political party MUDA. So to give a bit of context, MUDA, which is a political party in Malaysia, or the Malaysian United Democratic Alliance, in short, it's called MUDA, which is young in Malay, is a youth-oriented political party in Malaysia. A youth party, you may say, which in reality sounds way less interesting than what it actually implies. Now, it was formed after the collapse of the Pakatan Harapan government, which took down the old ruling party that basically Barisan Nasional and UMNO and their component parties that basically ruled the country ever since we gained independence from the British in 1957 and 1963 when we formed Malaysia in itself. All of this happened and all crashed down, Pakatan Harapan in general, in early 2020, which seems like a tiny anecdote in comparison to the disaster that was the Coronavirus and Friends World Tour 2020, which explains why I'm in the quarantine right now. Now, this political party was led by former youth minister, which sounds way too Christian than it actually should, Syed Sadiq. Now, MUDA claims to be a political party for the youth. So it's basically for anyone under 35, if you would like to consider that as the youth. And they want to have the youth in almost all leadership positions. Now, aside from Syed Sadiq, who at that point was the youngest minister in Malaysia's history ever, so the Emmanuel Macron, Barack Obama worshipping leader, the party was also formed by other prominent figures like Lim Wee Jet, who is a young lawyer slash University Malaya grad who has been vocal on social media on many multiple legal issues itself. Now, to give them credit, they did manage to get thousands of signups within a really short period on the day they opened up for signups, which is probably unprecedented in Malaysian history in general. Now, before I go on, I just want to make several clarifications. First of all, I've known Sadiq for ages. Okay, probably known is like probably a stretch of the word. Like it's more like a one-way relationship. Now, I'm not like a superstar like him when it comes to the debating world because we're all part of that Malaysian debating circle in some sense, or Widget at the same time. He was also part of the debating circle. Now, both of them probably had way more interesting debating careers than mine, and even then, I guess it's sort of like an understatement on how it works. And despite only being several years apart and being within that university social circle, I'm very well aware that my critiques or whatever I'm about to say about MUDA and why I'm not happy with them may sound like it comes from a very pompous, bitter person. To a certain degree, I do admit that I've not used my privileges as well as he probably did, or they probably did, to bring in some form of political mileage against the previous ruling government, which was Barisan Nasional. So you could say that I'm a person who didn't fully utilize what I had when I was in university, despite having the same platforms in some sense. But as a person outside of that system, and I could still rationalize my ideas and so on, I do hope my critiques are still given the proper respect. Now, with that context out of the way, you might be asking, why do I say that I'm not a big fan of MUDA? Or why do I have a love-hate relationship with the political party in general? Like, it's a political party that is up against a conservative nationalist bloc, which is Perikatan Nasional. And as a person who has some kind of opposition against those kind of ideas, you might think I would be the first person to jump into this political party, especially considering the fact that we do have some kind of similarities and we have a shared history in university and so on. To understand this, I'm going to answer three different questions. First of all, what does MUDA actually stand for? And number two, what happens when you have whatever MUDA is believing in itself? And I guess to some extent, number three, I'm going to talk about how this could lead to some kind of abuse or some kind of hijacking within the political party in the future. So my concerns are a bit more within the long term in comparison to the short term gains that they may have in general. So let's look at the first question. What does MUDA actually stand for? Well, coming from the name itself, if you speak Bahasa Malaysia or Bahasa Indonesia, you probably understand that MUDA actually means young. And well, that's where they've been arguing their position. All they want is young people in greater positions of power, and Sadiq, as a young person, I guess, just wants greater representation. So you could say that it is some kind of an identity politics kind of thing, but instead of having race, so instead of having sexuality, instead of having religion, they use their age as some kind of the way to carry the identity politics. And I do understand it's kind of weird because we all are going to grow old eventually. We will all end up with wrinkles. So how can you start a political party and only allow young people to hold leadership positions? So this is where they try to sneakily allow some kind of leeway by saying that, well, we do allow everyone to become part of the political party. So basically, if you do believe in their beliefs, assuming they do have some, then you can be part of it, but you will not be the priority, which brings the first red flag into this whole conundrum. Second of all, they believe that they should be a multiracial party. Now, to the outside world, that might be we should not encourage racism or stuff like that. But in the context of Malaysia, you could say that it's slightly novel. I know there are other multiracial political party, but considering the fact that Syed Saddiq, and this is like more of a background of who he is before this, he came from this political party called Bersatu. Bersatu, ironically, means to be united, but they fractured at this point. And at the second line of irony is that Bersatu is a Malay first political party in some sense. But of course, we can talk about how it's very different from the ruling political party previously, which is UMNO, which literally stands for the United Malay National Organizations. And they used to rule the political party. And Bersatu are basically people who initially came from UMNO. And in order for you to be part of UMNO, you have to be a Malay. And they're basically the majority in Malaysia to some extent. And UMNO has been fighting for Malay rights and so on. And I can understand a huge chunk of it. And a lot of things that UMNO spoke about in the past did come from very leftist origins by arguing for affirmative action, arguing for redistribution. But of course, these kind of things can also be hijacked, and that sort of led to kleptocracy and, as usual, as how you might listen to the same story in different countries, that sort of allowed some level of neoliberalism to occur under the reign of Dr. Mahathir Mohamad in the past. But in general, Malays are basically the majority in the country, and previous governments have always been led by political parties that tend to have that Malay exclusivity. So to have somebody who used to be from a Malay-only political party to form a multiracial party, I guess it's sort of novel in Malaysia, and they're not the first. But the point is that it's a great detachment, and I guess that's a win in that sense. But aside from that, I'm not so sure what exactly they believe in. And this is where I have a bunch of issues in general. Because at least from the surface, it is perceived to be that they are the kind of technocratic, political centrist political party that has the image of maturity. But in the reality is that their political centrism might eventually push them rightward. And we are seeing the seeds of that today with how they have sort of like spoken or basically gain people who would easily fall under the category of neoliberals, but might not exactly identify themselves as neoliberals like today, because that political lexicon probably isn't in the vocabulary of most Malaysians who um, might not be interested in those political terms in the first place. They would prefer something easy. So I guess MUDA sort of um, capitalize on that. Which leads to the second question. What happens then when you have the beliefs that MUDA have? Or, I hate saying this, but what happens when you don't have a proper ideology? Well, that would mean you would champion things that are whatever that's popular at that moment. Unfortunately, this means that MUDA is less likely to question things like neoliberal economics. It would basically reinforce the status quo, but just a different flavor. So now I can understand probably that he is a secret right winger and so on, and I know people who are technically economically right wing who think that MUDA is the way to go forward. But the problem is that Sadiq came from a tradition of the debating community that has always been um, sort of like center left in some sense, and at their worst points, they do have that liberal bias. And once in a while, we would argue stuff that is within leftist economics and so on. But it is some sort of like a disappointment thinking that he would take that line eventually. The problem here is that when they try to portray themselves as a technocratic centrist organization, this would basically allow them to be pushed into certain positions where they might want to be appear as bipartisan. And there was this one period um, during our version of the coronavirus lockdown, which we call the Movement Control Order, or in Malay we call it PKP. We've had some sort of a political struggle, and the current ruling government, which is Perikatan Nasional, is led by Sadiq's former political party, which is Bersatu. But Bersatu, who initially fought against the previous Barisan National government, is now working with the remnants of the Barisan National government. And they've basically formed a new government called Perikatan Nasional. Um, but it's a very thin majority because they technically didn't win elections. The only reason why they are in power because it is basically because you had people who were originally part of Pakatan Harapan who jumped into that new Perikatan Nasional. And one of the most notorious figures is Azmin Ali. And of course, our former deputy prime minister Muhyiddin also jumped along, and he became the prime minister of this new government instead, um, and that sort of allowed them to become in power in itself. So within that political struggle, and people were not happy that we had that political struggle. We had state elections in the state of Sabah, and because of the physical elections, we had a huge spread of the coronavirus. So we had a whole other wave of the coronavirus, and a lot of people are not happy that politicians are also bickering about getting into power. And we've had the leader of opposition Anwar Ibrahim claiming to have all the numbers for him to become prime minister. Which means that if he were to succeed and if he actually had those strong, formidable numbers, he would probably become prime minister. Um, if that were to succeed, he would basically um, form a new government, which means Malaysian would have a second change of government in 2020 during the middle of a pandemic. Now, if you're not happy with the current government, which is Perikatan Nasional, this could be a slight welcoming change in some sense. I'm not a big fan of Anwar Ibrahim in general, but I can see what he is fighting for or what he is defending in itself. But I can understand also why Malaysians will be fed up. So this is where MUDA comes in. And MUDA has basically said that, well, we should pause whatever it is. They ran this huge social media campaign called Pause Malaysia, that we should stop bickering over seats, stop convincing people to jump over to the other side of the political aisle and act as quote unquote mature adults and fight for the people first. The question that becomes, fight for what exactly? Because if we are facing like a government that is sort of like, to some extent you could argue, as inefficient, or they aren't able to actually control the spread of the coronavirus in the middle of elections, or unwilling to actually figure out alternatives to physical elections, physical voting, then why would you want to defend that government in some sense? So it created this really weird position that made people ask, does this actually mean we should stop demanding accountability from Muhyiddin and his Perikatan National Government? There was a bit of confusion there, and then eventually they backtracked, or I'm not so sure if that's what they actually believe, and said that, well, this does not mean that we shouldn't be able to come together and act more mature. You could still demand accountability, apparently, which was kind of weird, because how exactly are you going to appear politically neutral? How exactly are you going to pause politics if you are demanding accountability and are attacking the policies coming from the current government, which personally was kind of weird. It means that you want to conveniently write this whole idea of centrism in the first place. But the second part of this is that Sadiq sort of like demanded some kind of bipartisanship, or at least the core people of MUDA sort of wanted that form of bipartisanship. The problem with bipartisanship in a country like Malaysia is that you have to understand that back in 2018, the country was being run by a, put in nicer terms, a nationalist government. And you also had a former prime minister. His name is Najib Razak. There are quite a number of people that you could argue also had his same kleptocratic tendencies. And he was embroiled in the 1MDB scandal. So these are the very same people that you want to reach across the aisle and work together. And they've had this really bad PR moment where Sadiq actually met with our former prime minister and took photos with him, by creating this illusion that they are politically mature, and they are willing to put aside their differences in order to fight for the rakyat, or the people. That's what we call riot, the taxpayers and so on. So what exactly are you fighting in itself? If you claim that is basically what the rakyat wants and what exactly the rakyat is demanding, what about the mandate from the previous election in 2018 that basically rejected the kleptocratic tendencies and the 1MDB scandal that Najib Razak has put and humiliated Malaysia through in general? It basically means that you are giving him some kind of legitimacy all over again. And it's kind of weird because we've had like this huge political moment where we basically claim that we fought against corruption that a lot of countries cannot even handle in the first place. Yet there you are, standing next to people who are the source of misery in Malaysia in the first place, and you are using that as a way to portray yourself as politically mature. Also, if Sadiq really was bipartisan, he probably wouldn't throw the LGBTQ community under the bus. And you are legitimizing him in some sense. So that pissed off quite a lot of people, including me, in some sense. Which then leads to the third problem that I have when it comes to this whole lack of ideology in some sense. The problem here is that if you are defining your political party as a youth-oriented party, you practically have limited ammunition in politics because you have other more established parties like the Democratic Action Party, which is DAP, and you have PKR, which is basically the People's Justice Party. They don't sound as leftist as how they describe themselves and so on. But the point is that these two political parties are the opposition or have been the opposition for quite some time, plus another party called Amanah. And they've already gained some kind of traction. So, how would they perceive MUDA in the future? There is a possibility that MUDA will be treated as a novelty. That if anyone wants to climb into the ranks of DAP or the Democratic Action Party, it's so easy to push them towards MUDA by themselves, and they will be treated as if that they are the youth wing of their political party. I'm not saying that it is what is going on right now. I'm just saying that this is how it can be perceived in the future. And it's kind of hard for people to climb up the ranks of DAP, which is much more, I guess, slightly more ideologically inclined. They have some kind of beliefs in comparison to MUDA, though there on some other day, I could argue about how DAP is a bigger tent that also includes neoliberals and also, social democratic, believers, SOCDEMs basically, and socialists within that big tent in itself. At least anything in opposition to the current nationalist administration. Now, because of all of that, it's harder to take MUDA seriously when they are perceived to be the youth wing of these bigger political parties instead. And they might have the problem of not having the ability to negotiate the number of seats that they may have to actually spread out in comparison to DAP and PKR. I understand that this is a bigger problem with our first past the post system that we inherited through British colonialism. And in the future, I do prefer if we have like a ranked choice system that is a bit more progressive instead, that allows more political parties to actually, mushroom in the country. And maybe I would then start my own political party, whatever it is. But the point is that how are you going to negotiate against behemoths like DAP and PKR? They would just be happy with you having that one seat in Muar, Sadiq. That's where you are basically stuck there and you aren't able to grow. And you are forever condemned to be a youth political party that people push to you. And what happens when you grow old? Are you then going to move to a different political party that is a bit more ideologically inclined? Are you then still going to represent that youth political party, or are you going to take a back seat and allow younger people to be part of it, which then sort of like which is kind of weird because change isn't very dependent on your age in itself. I mean, look at Bernie Sanders, who's an extent. He's quite old. He's older than my grandmother who passed away recently, and his ideas were more important than his age. Now, I understand the fact that you don't have to be the same person over and over again running for politics, holding the same ideas. But if somebody has something legitimate to say, then they should have that platform, and they should exist regardless. And that's where your ideologies or your policies are the ones that should be given the greater representation instead. Which then leads to my fourth problem with MUDA, or the lack of ideology in MUDA, which is the ability for people to hijack your political party. So today, maybe MUDA is like a bit center left, I guess. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt that somehow Sadiq is, let's say, within that side of the political spectrum in some sense. Let's give him that benefit of the doubt. The problem is that in the future, if he were to retire from politics, somebody might just be able to push the party rightward because there is no proper ideology behind them. And it's easy for people to say, let's say, right, it becomes more neoliberal, it is already quite neoliberal, but let's say they go even more neoliberal with borderline Thatcherism or something along the lines. This would probably lead them to have some kind of immunity within politics, because they are able to say, are you then questioning the ability of the youth? Because you are treating the youth as a protected class today, and they are able to use young people as a shield. And it's so easy for them to fight for these policies and paint all the critiques in the future as if that they are anti-youth. They don't like what the future has to provide for this specific political party. Now, just as a recap of what I spoke about, number one, they might just reinforce the status quo. Number two, bipartisanship, or at least the perception of bipartisanship and this whole politics of spectacle would basically empower people who are pretty right wing in this country. And you might empower kleptocrats that we tried to put in jail, even though Najib Razak is not in jail currently. But number three, the health of this political party wouldn't be that great, because you have to negotiate with other opposition leaders who might be stronger, who might have a bigger say, who has bigger clout in some sense, and they are able to push you and treat you as if that they're the youth wing of their political party. But number four, it allows people to hijack your ideas and are able to use you as a shield, basically turning the youth as a protected class and use that to defend horrible right-wing ideas in the future, and say that that's what the people want in itself, even though that may not reflect the reality. But it would harm that discourse in some sense, like the propensity for abuse. But enough of the really super negative side of things, that you might be tired of me listening or talking about all of this. To a certain extent, like, I do respect MUDA, and if I had the choice to vote, or if I were forced to vote between MUDA and again Nationalist Party like UMNO or Bersatu, whoever it is, or maybe a theocratic party like PAS, I would probably just push for MUDA in general. At the very least, they're multiracial, and at the very least, a person like me who's not Malay could probably join it, and I would feel included to some extent. Well, that's roughly it. Thank you for listening. I just miss talking to people during quarantine, and that was my rant. Maybe I'll put up some fake credits for people who sort of help me with some of my ideas here.